My name is Elaine Porter, and the day I broke my husband's one rule, my marriage ended with the quiet click of a key. Never step into my office, Rick used to say, smiling like it was a joke, but he always pocketed the key and shut the door before dinner. That Monday morning, he left for a 2-day conference in St. Louis, his suitcase rolling across the hardwood, his travel mug leaving a ring on the counter I wiped out of habit. He kissed the air near my cheek, told me not to fuss, and drove away. 10 minutes later, I found the key he'd forgotten glinting in a small dish by the phone like a dare I'd waited 25 years to accept. I stood in the hallway with my coffee cooling in my hand, eyeing that door at the end, white paint brass knob, the little strip of light at the threshold. Our house in Carmel, Indiana is the kind where neighbors wave from their mailboxes, where the HOA sends reminders about lawn heights, where people know your dog's names and forget your middle name. We built a life here. School auctions, backyard barbecues, Christmas Eve at St. Mark's, Friday nights at the high school stadium, me teaching 3rd grade and him building a logistics company from spare parts and grit. I learned to live with that closed door the way you live with a mole you keep meaning to get checked. It didn't hurt, so I ignored it until the key lay there, warm from the sun waiting. I wish I could tell you I prayed, or that I called my daughter, or that I took a walk to think better of it. I didn't. I slid the key into the lock and felt the kind of tremor in my fingertips that I hadn't felt since prom night. The lock turned. The latch gave. The door opened on its hinges with a soft sigh, and the smell hit first paper and printer toner and a faint lemon polish. Rick loved the scent of some other life I wasn't invited to enter. I crossed the threshold and my breath stumbled in my throat at the sight of what waited inside. But before any of that, before the desk and the shelves and the labels that would rearrange the map of my whole life, there was the day that made the key feel inevitable 2 weeks earlier in the conference room at Porter and Hale Logistics, with a dozen employees and a box of donuts between us. Rick had forgotten to tell me the auditors were there. He'd asked me to drop off binders I kept at home from the early years, the ones with invoices I'd saved in case the bank ever questioned our line of credit. Just put them on the table and sit, he said, like I was the receptionist. A woman with a sharp jaw and a navy suit introduced herself as being from an outside firm. She kept calling me Mrs. Porter, like a substitute teacher trying to place a parent at open house. When Rick started talking about cash flow, he didn't look at me. He told a neat story about seasonal dips and pandemic delays and a temporary hiccup with a supplier in Dayton. The woman in the navy suit asked questions like hooks dragging bigger things to the surface each time, and he smoothed the water with the ease of a man who'd done this dance before. I sat there with my hands folded and said nothing, because every time I opened my mouth to add a detail when the supplier had actually paid what account we'd used to front payroll, his toe found my shoe under the table and pressed down. Later in the parking lot, when I said, "You made me look like furniture in there," he laughed and told me not to be dramatic. That laugh was still rattling around inside me when I opened the office door. Across the room, the window faced the maple in our backyard, newly leafed and casting green light like lake water. Rick's desk sat square to the view. The good leather chair angled just so the pens aligned with an almost military precision. On the wall hung the framed articles from the Indianapolis Business Journal, the ribbon from when he cut the warehouse expansion, the certificate from the Chamber of Commerce naming him Businessman of the Year the same spring our daughter Megan left for grad school. Everything in here hummed with order and success and that particular male confidence that says I have earned this. I walked past the chair and set my coffee on the corner of the desk. The coaster was embossed with our initials E and R, a wedding gift from someone who believed we were entering a partnership. The computer was dark. The printer's light blinked patient. A paper trimmer sat on the credenza, its blade glinting. It would have been easy to turn around and pretend I'd never been here, to let the lemon polish stand in for truth, to go fold laundry and act like the old fool Rick must have believed I was. But some doors once opened refused to close. Maybe that's why my eyes landed on the first thing that didn't match the curated picture. A banker's box tucked on the floor beside the desk lid, half off, as if it had swallowed too much and lost its grip. You know those boxes from moving day that never quite get emptied? It was like that, except this one was packed to the top and neatly, no chaos, no random cords. Each manila folder inside wore a label printed by a label maker, the same kind I used on my classroom bins when I taught crayons glue sticks, storybooks. The labels in this box were different. My name on the first, Porter Elaine Primary. I felt the air shift. Beneath it, Porter Elaine Truss. Another Porter Elaine Property. My hand hovered over the files like I was reaching into an aquarium and didn't know if something inside would bite. It would be tidy to say I flipped the top folder and the universe split open. That came later. In that first minute, what cracked me open was the familiarity, my own name in fonts. He chose my life reduced to office supply entries in a room I wasn't supposed to see. Across the room, a bookcase held rows of binders, all white with labeled spines and measured lines, accounts, vendors, payroll, historical leases, insurance, and then like a quiet cough in a church pew there, it was again, Porter, Elaine, Miss. I remember thinking, Miss, what? I stood very still and listened. The house made its small sounds, the refrigerator cycling, the air conditioner kicking on a dog barking 2 yards over. Somewhere a lawn service truck grumbled to a stop, and you could almost hear the tap of a text arriving on a teenager's phone next door. The ordinary world kept going steady as a metronome, while in my husband's office a new rhythm started in my chest that I would later recognize as the beginning of the end. I pulled out the desk chair and sat. The leather eased around me like a secret. On the blotter lay a legal pad with Rick's blocky handwriting marching across it, a to-do list with check boxes more than half filled in. Call Jean shelving email. Mike reinsurance renewal, remind D. Dinner Thurs. At the bottom under a drawn line, 3 words, Plan B finalize. I set my palm over those words. The room seemed to narrow, pulling my focus to the box on the floor again. The corner of a blue folder stuck out from beneath my name. The label read Correspondence Council. The old teacher in me, the woman who had spent years telling 8-year-olds to respect privacy and keep their hands to themselves, hesitated. The wife in me, the woman who had made casseroles and budgets and excuses, hesitated harder. The version of me that had been humiliated in that conference room 2 weeks earlier, the woman Rick treated like furniture, reached down and slid the folder free. I hadn't even opened it yet, and already the old life had tilted. And that more than the lemon polish, more than the maple's green light, more than the faint hum of the printer, is what made me freeze the knowledge that whatever lay in those files was about to decide the shape of the rest of my life. The blue folder trembled in my hands the way a church bulletin does when you realize the sermon is about your own sins. Correspondence Council. It sounded dry as dust, but the first page slid out like a blade. A letterhead I recognized, Gaffney and Sloan Rick's corporate attorneys. The subject line, Recontingency, Structure, Personal Exposure. My name appeared twice in the first paragraph. The third time it showed up, it was next to the phrase, Ideal Firewall. I read it once too fast and nothing registered. I read it again, forcing my eyes to slow down. They were discussing a reorganization event, a euphemism only lawyers could love. If Porter and Hale needed to restructure, the safest path was to shift titled obligations to the spousal entity where public sympathy and limited prior executive exposure would minimize reputational harm. Spousal entity. That was me. The letter proposed 3 steps. 1, refinancing the lake cabin in my name. 2, moving a credit line to an LLC of which I was sole member. 3, assigning certain vendor guarantees to my personal trust, Porter Family Trust, of which, surprise, I was the grantor and trustee. It was all written like a recipe. Add wife. Stir. Bake at medium heat until liabilities transfer. I set the letter down and swallowed back a wave of nausea that tasted like metal. The next document was an action checklist with boxes, some checked, in Rick's blocky hand. Elaine to sign POA Limited Banking. Check. Elaine to sign mortgage, Mod Lake Lemon. Check. Lake Lemon, the cabin our daughter painted on a Mother's Day card when she was 10. I had signed a stack of papers last fall at the kitchen island, while Rick stirred chili and teased me about reading every syllable like a librarian. He'd tucked a post-it on top, just a couple of renewals, honey. I need them back by 5. He had kissed my head. I had signed where the tabs told me to sign. The folder yielded emails, so many emails between Rick and a partner at the firm. At first, they were couched in corporate lingo about de-risking and optics, but by page 5, the mask slipped. Elaine has an excellent reputation at St. Mark's and in the school district. If she's named on certain instruments, any negative press will land softer. Think devoted teacher blindsided. I felt my jaw tighten so hard my molars ached. They were weaponizing my good name. My years of bake sales and late nights grading spelling tests were now a PR buffer for a man who wouldn't let me into his office. A smaller envelope nestled at the back. Inside were 2 copies of a document stamped recorded with a county seal. Deed transfers. The lake cabin now in my name alone. The second page was a mortgage modification, the rate, the term, the balloon I didn't remember agreeing to. My signature looped across the bottom. I touched the ink like maybe it would wipe off. It didn't. Paper doesn't care how a pen got into your hand. The next folder was thicker and heavier, and I needed both hands to lift it onto the desk. Porter Elaine Truss. My stomach dropped even before I opened it. The first page named me as grantor and trustee of the Porter Family Trust, established 18 months ago for estate simplification. There were schedules lists of assets held by the trust. The lake cabin. A brokerage account I didn't know existed holding a handful of beat-up stocks, and more interestingly, a pile of junk private notes on vendors I recognized from Rick's warehouse days. Then came a line that made the room tilt: personal guarantees assigned. The trust had assumed guarantee obligations on 4 vendor contracts and 1 trucking lease. In plain English, if things went south, my trust me owed the money. There was a handwritten note in Rick's voice stuck to the top of an unsigned draft. Once we get through Q3, we'll rebalance. That might have sounded benign if not for the emails tucked behind it, an attorney explaining how placing guarantees at the spousal trust level kept Rick's executive profile intact and left maximum optionality if they needed to pivot to bankruptcy. Optionality. I let the word sit there like a lump in the throat of a liar. My hands were shaking now, not just from anger, but from the cold realization of how deep this ran. In a side pocket of the folder, I found a banking letter. We are pleased to confirm the approval of a home equity line of credit in the amount of $175,000 secured by 18 North Birch. Our house. Another tabbed signature line. Another date I remembered vaguely. February, a snow day, chilly again. Rick, in good spirits, telling me we'd remodel the kitchen once supply chains calmed down. The line of credit had been drawn to 92%. The statement was stapled to the back, with transfers to an account ending in numbers I didn't recognize. I slid my chair back and pressed my palms to my knees to steady myself. On the credenza, a photo of Megan at her college graduation smiled out at me, cap crooked, freckles bright in the May sun. I thought of her new apartment in Chicago, her calls on Sunday nights about clients and deadlines, and whether she was too young to start using eye cream. How do you tell your daughter that her father looked at her mother and didn't see a partner, but a useful shield? The next binder on the shelf was Insurance Personal. I pulled it free because the word felt safer. Insurance is what you buy when you love people, when you admit you're not bulletproof. Page 1. Life insurance policies. Rick's term policy, mine a small policy left over from when Megan was a child, all neat as laundry on a line. Page 2 stopped me cold. Beneficiary change forms last fall. Rick's primary beneficiary had been switched from me to the company's key person policy arrangement. I knew enough to understand the shape of that. If he died, the company would be paid to stabilize operations. The note in the margin in the attorney's tidy hand read, "We can show spousal support via separate instruments if optics demand." Optics. Again. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the room hadn't changed. The maple still moved in the breeze. The printer light still blinked. My coffee had cooled into that bitter film that coats your tongue. I set the insurance binder down and returned to the banker's box to a manila folder labeled Property Residential. Our deed. The legal description of a lot I could walk in my sleep. Attached was a draft quitclaim deed, unused, unsigned, moving my interest to the Trust for Estate Planning. The legal pad on the desk with Plan B finalized suddenly had a drumbeat under it I could hear. At the bottom of the box lay a thinner folder with a label that made my breath hitch: PR Crisis. Inside were clippings from local papers about other families' misfortunes, bankruptcies, indictments, the glossy Facebook photos of wives who looked like me, except their smiles had the brittle shine of porcelain. There were talking points drafted by someone at the firm, scripts for what to say to church friends, neighbors, the chamber. "Elaine is a pillar of the community," one sentence began, "and we ask that you give the family privacy during this challenging time." The last page was a list of community touchpoints with my name next to almost everyone: PTA, past president, Sunday school, volunteer, United Way, campaign liaison. I was an asset to be deployed in war. The anger rose then, not the theatrical kind, but the low, steady burn of a pilot light catching. It lit every year I'd packed lunches and balanced checkbooks and pretended the toe on my shoe under the conference table was a love tap, not a warning. It lit the ridiculous memory of me setting aside a summer trip because the company needs a little runway. It lit the night I sat in a dark car outside the warehouse, while Rick finished a late meeting the way anger keeps its own counsel until it has something to say. I put the blue folder back where I found it and closed the banker's box. Then I pulled it out again because the part of me that had taught children to show their work knew I would need more than anger. I set my phone camera to silent and started taking pictures, letters, deeds, checklists with check marks. I moved like a nurse in a crisis, steady, efficient, sleeves up, because the woman who had lived in this house for 25 years wasn't going to be the fall guy in a story he wrote. When I finished, I stood in the doorway with my hand on the knob and looked back once. The room still gleamed with lemon polish and triumph, but now the shine looked like grease on a plate after a meal you regret. I shut the door gently, slid the key into my pocket, and went to the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. I would need it. The rest of my life had just begun drafting its own plan. I didn't cry. I wanted to there in the kitchen with the coffee sputtering, and the blue folder still warming my hands, but tears felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I opened a drawer, took out the yellow legal pad we kept next to the takeout menus, and wrote the date at the top. Under it, I made a list of what I'd photographed and what I had indeed transferred: HELOC, trust schedules, guarantees, PR, crisis, talking points. Then I added a line break and wrote 3 names I could trust: Pastor Ruth, my neighbor Diane, who'd weathered her own divorce with quiet grit, and Jonathan Hale, our accountant from the early days, who'd left the company the month Rick took on the new partners. The list steadied me. Lists always had. Before the coffee finished, I went back in. Not into the room. Not yet. I stood in the hallway and looked at the door like it might look back. After 20 minutes of staring at nothing, I took the key out of my pocket and locked the office. I placed the key in the same dish where I'd found it, then pulled out my phone and created a new album labeled House Files. If anyone ever questioned the order of things, I wanted metadata, timestamps, a breadcrumb trail. I texted Megan a heart and a link to a goofy video of a dog on a skateboard because that's what mothers do. When the ground shifts, they leave the surface undisturbed for their children as long as possible. By noon, I was in my car, a sweater thrown over my shoulders against a wind that smelled like rain. I drove to the county recorder's office, the same place we'd gone to file our first deed a lifetime ago, when we thought adulthood was a certificate you could hang on a wall. In the lobby, a sign pointed toward public terminals. A clerk with a gray bob and the kind of tired smile you see on people who've dealt with forms all their lives explained how to search by name. Spellings matter, she warned, tapping the laminated rules. And don't forget to check trusts. I typed my own name and watched it bloom across the screen like a rash. Deed Lake Lemon, mortgage modification, HELOC North Birch. I printed the index pages and paid for certified copies of each instrument. The clerk stamped thunk, thunk, thunk like a gavel. When I asked about the trust, she told me those schedules don't always record publicly. People like privacy, she said, her tone neutral, as though we were discussing curtain rods, not lives. Still, I found a memorandum of trust, thin, almost coy, announcing the entity to the world, without revealing what sat inside. I bought that too. On my way out, I stopped at the bank. The same bank where Rick and I had opened our first savings account and posed for a picture with an umbrella that said "Plan for Rain." I asked for copies of our last 6 months of statements. The teller, a man young enough to be one of my former students, glanced at my driver's license, then at the screen. "We can print those," he said, cheerful in the way of people who don't yet know how expensive cheerfulness can be. I tucked the envelope into my tote and said thank you with the same voice I used to use on field trips when I wanted children to stay calm crossing a street. At home, I spread the papers across the dining table like pieces to a puzzle nobody wanted. The transfers from the HELOC matched deposits into the business account, then moved to a series of numbers I didn't recognize, an account at a different bank, the name of which I knew but had never used. A vendor I remembered from 2012 appeared again with an amount that made sense only if you liked math that hid itself. In the memo lines, there were words that read like, "Nothing supplies, miss." Freight, but stacked together, they whispered a story the business was bleeding, and Rick was transfusing with our house. At 2, I called Jonathan Hale. He answered on the second ring with the steady voice of a man who still balanced his checkbook by hand. "Elaine." He sounded surprised. We hadn't talked in months. I told him I had a few questions about old records and whether he had time for coffee. "For you," he said, "always. My office at 4. Bring whatever you've got. And Elaine, drive safe." The way people from Indiana say drive safe when what they mean is I'm worried. With 2 hours to burn and a stomach that couldn't decide whether to growl or revolt, I opened my laptop at the kitchen counter and searched Gaffney and Sloan. Their website smiled back with stock photos of successful men shaking hands and women in navy suits looking at tablets on glass tables. On a hunch, I typed the name of the partner, whose emails I'd read, and added the word discipline. It produced nothing. Lawyers keep clean glass shelves. But when I searched his name with bankruptcy up, came a handful of client alerts about spousal exposure, the same phrase that had turned my name into a shield. Then, against every hummingbird instinct in my body, I opened Rick's email on my phone. We shared a family plan. He'd never changed his password from our daughter's birthday and the name of his high school team. I'd never looked before. I told myself I would search one-word Plan B. I typed hit return and watched a list populate: subject lines, attachments, the name of the partner at Gaffney and Sloan repeating like a drum. The most recent was 3 days old. Plan B timing. I didn't open it. Not then. I took a picture of the header and closed the app because the kitchen felt suddenly too small to hold that kind of knowledge. I arrived at Jonathan's office 10 minutes early and sat in the parking lot with the engine off. Across the street, a group of retirees and windbreakers walked past the hardware store, hands tucked into pockets against the spring wind. Ordinary life kept doing what it does: mail arriving, casseroles cooling on counters, dogs hauling their owners down sidewalks, while my own life reshuffled itself into a deck with marked cards. When I finally went inside, Jonathan met me with the same grave kindness he'd shown when he drove all the way to our first warehouse at midnight to fix a payroll file that refused to upload. He listened while I spoke, interrupting only to ask for dates, names, copies. He didn't gasp or curse, which somehow made it worse. Accountants know that numbers don't need adjectives. When I finished, he sat back, steepled his fingers, and let out a long breath through his nose. First, he said, "I'm sorry. This is a betrayal financially, yes, but worse than that." He tapped the stack with one finger. Second, you were smart to get documents before confronting him. Third, don't confront him. Not yet. I wasn't going to? I lied. I had wanted to march home, pile the papers in his leather chair, and ask him how long he'd been rehearsing my downfall. You need an attorney who represents only you, Jonathan continued. Someone who doesn't golf with Rick or sit on a board with him. Not a bulldog who will blow up the neighborhood. A quiet hammer. I'll text you 2 names. He paused, then added, and start a timeline. Write down everything you sign, every conversation, every odd request. If this goes to court judges, like dates. On my way out, he touched my elbow in that Midwestern way men his age use to keep things decent. You're not alone, Elaine. If you need a witness to character, you have a town full. At dusk, I sat in the car outside St. Mark's and watched the sanctuary lights come on one by one like windows in a city at night. I didn't go in. I didn't need a pew to know what I was doing. I needed a plan. Back home, I made chicken salad the way Rick liked it, grape celery, the good mayonnaise, because nothing scares a guilty man more than a woman who keeps supper on the table and her cards to herself. I set his plate in the fridge and turned off the kitchen light. In bed, I stared at the ceiling fan. When I heard the garage door rumble and the door open, I didn't move. He came in smelling like travel soap and the inside of rental cars. Everything okay? He asked, as if the world hadn't shifted in his absence. Everything's fine, I said, because for the first time in a long time it was. I had seen the map. I knew where the roads went, and I was done being the lane he drove in without looking. I closed my eyes and slept hard, asleep with edges. In the morning, I would call one of Jonathan's attorneys. I would buy a portable scanner at Office Max. I would label a folder storm and fill it one clean page at a time. I would smile when he told me not to fuss. I would not fuss. I would build. Jonathan's text with 2 attorney names came at 7:12 a.m., the way good news does too early to be anything else. I called the first one, got an associate who sounded like she ate deadlines for breakfast and left a message. The second, Elizabeth Carver, picked up herself. Her voice was low and hurried, like a doctor who's already seen your x-ray and doesn't need theatrics. Come at 9, she said. Bring copies. Bring your driver's license. Don't sign anything else before we talk. I put on the navy blazer I wore to parent-teacher nights when I wanted principals to remember I was competent without my saying so, and I drove downtown with a folder labeled Storm on the seat beside me like a seatbelt. Elizabeth's office wasn't marble and chrome. It was a converted bungalow on Delaware with creaky floors and a bowl of peppermints that had softened into ovals. A cross-stitch in the waiting room read, Do justice. Love mercy. Wash your hands. I liked her before she opened the conference room door. She listened without interrupting while I laid out the documents, my timeline, the smell of lemon polish still ghosting my sentences. When I finished, she stacked the papers into tidy piles and slid a legal pad toward me. "We're going to do 3 things," she said. "Protect, preserve, prepare." Protect means you. She continued ticking off items with a pen. Separate checking account at a different bank this afternoon. Freeze the credit bureaus. Add fraud alerts. Get a P.O. box. Redirect anything financial there. Revoke any power of attorney you've signed unless I tell you otherwise. We'll draft a revocation and overnight it to the bank. Change your passwords. Do not confront him. "I won't," I said, and meant it in a way I hadn't the day before. Preserve means evidence, she went on. Keep photographing, scan where you can. Don't move originals unless you truly fear they'll disappear. Make an inventory of what you've seen. Keep it contemporaneous. Judges love a neat timeline. And Elaine, don't forward emails from his account. Logins can be traced. Take screenshots of subject lines with dates if you must. We'll subpoena content later. I nodded, embarrassment stinging at the mention of his email. I only searched a phrase. Good. Stop there. She tapped the 3rd word. Prepare means strategy. We can unwind fraudulent conveyances if the timing is right. Those guarantees assigned to your trust troubling. We'll challenge them. We may file a notice with the bank about the HELOC draws. At minimum, we'll request that any further advances require dual signatures. Do not sign anything, not a postcard, not a delivery slip without my eyes on it. If he leaves you, just a couple of renewals, you smile and say you'll review later. She asked about safety, the quiet kind. Has he ever raised a hand, slammed a door, cornered you? I thought of the toe on my shoe under the conference table, the laughs that weren't jokes. No, I said, but he likes winning. She nodded and slid me a card for a locksmith who discreetly rekeys houses for women with husbands who like winning. We talked taxes because that's where truth hides. We talked insurance beneficiaries and key person policies. Elizabeth's mouth tightened when I told her about the change. We'll request policy information. There are spousal consent rules. If they got that wrong, we'll use it. She wrote down the names of the Gaffney and Sloan partners and underlined one twice. I've dealt with him. He thinks the world is a chessboard where he is always white. When I left, I had a retainer agreement, a list of to-dos, and a feeling I hadn't felt since Megan was born, and the nurse put her in my arms and said, "You can do this." I drove to the post office and rented a box, P.O. Box 421 a number. I repeated under my breath like a scripture. At the bank, I opened an account in my name only and moved my teacher's pension deposits. I requested paper statements like it was 1997. At Office Max, I bought a portable scanner and a pack of manila folders, and the clerk talked me into a label maker I didn't need but suddenly wanted like armor. At home, I brewed tea and stood in the hallway looking at that white door the way you look at a pool before you jump in. He was at the office's calendar showing a vendor breakfast and a warehouse walkthrough. I locked his office behind me once I stepped inside. This time I wore cotton gloves left from Megan's art projects because Elizabeth had said, no fingerprints, no fights about smudged papers later. I set the scanner on the desk and worked through lunch feeding it pages in a rhythm that felt like prayer. Deed, trust schedule, guarantee assignment, PR crisis, action checklist, plan B finalize. I slid each finished stack into a manila folder and labeled it with the date and my initials, the way our old principal taught us to do with test packets. If you act like a professional, people remember you are one. At 2, Diane from next door texted Costco, run, need anything? I thought about replying milk. I typed, I'm okay, and then typed, actually, could you swing by later? I'd love to talk. Her thumb up bubble floated back. At 3, Pastor Ruth called as if my neighbor's fingers had dialed the church. Your name has been on my mind. She said, her voice a soft porch swing. I told her I was fine. We both knew what fine means when a woman says it that way. I'm making beef stew, she said. I'll bring you a container, no need to chat. Midwestern pastors are the only people who can feed your soul and your crock pot with the same ladle. At 4:30, my phone buzzed with an email alert I almost didn't check. The subject line, Conf Plan B finalize, and the sender was Gaffney and Sloan. It was an Outlook invitation forwarded to Rick and 2 others internal-only set for Thursday, 8 a.m. in the Porter and Hale conference room. The agenda line read, Finalize reorg structure, spousal exposure. My cheeks went cold. They were going to execute the recipe with me as the pan. Elizabeth picked up on the second ring. Good, she said, when I told her, we keep our heads. You do not attend. Let them think you are where you always are. I will be nearby. We arranged a time. She would sit at Silver Diner, across the street with a laptop and a cinnamon roll, and if anything illegal happened, she'd be a phone call away. Between now and then, she added no sudden changes. Don't spook him. If he asks you to sign something, you bring it to me. If he doesn't, we let them cook their stew. After dinner, chicken salad again. He didn't notice I walked with Diane down our street the way we had, 100 evenings after fireworks on the 4th or leaf piles in October. We didn't say the word divorce. We did say the word respect. He's always liked to hold the cards, she said carefully, the way friends do when the line between honesty and disloyalty is a tightrope. I figured you like not shuffling. I laughed softly. I liked thinking we were playing the same game. At bedtime, Rick was chatty upbeat in that way he is, when something has gone his way. Big week coming, he said, brushing his teeth too long, like he was cleaning a conscience. We'll have some decisions around the business. Might need you to run a couple documents down to the bank if I get jammed. My heart thudded, but my voice stayed cream smooth. Of course, I said. Just leave them on the counter. I lay awake after he started snoring, counting ceiling fan rotations until they matched my pulse. I thought about how women my age become invisible to waiters, to clerks, to husbands who learned their ambition by watching movie men stride through glass offices with women in pencil skirts holding clipboards behind them. I thought about third graders learning regrouping borrowing tens to make numbers balance, and how sometimes the simplest math is also the most unforgiving. Rick had borrowed against my life. On Thursday morning, I would start collecting. Wednesday, I moved quietly through the list. I bought a small fireproof safe and stored my passport, my birth certificate, and the flash drive of scans inside. I set up two-factor authentication on everything from email to my grocery rewards. I made a photocopy of the limited banking POA and tucked it under a magnet labeled "Don't," with a smiley face, a private joke that made me feel 17 and dangerous. I called Megan and asked about her week and her new client with the impossible timeline, and when she asked if Dad seemed stressed lately, I said, he's been busy because truth has a timetable too. That night, as we watched the local news, a segment ran about a family who'd lost their house to an adjustable rate they never saw coming. Rick snorted. People sign anything. I kept my face. I know I said folding a napkin into a square isn't that something. When the house went dark, I stood in the hallway with my hand on the cool brass of the office door and whispered the only prayer I could form. Let me stay calm. Let me stay smart. Let me not confuse anger with action. Then I went to bed and dreamed of a courtroom where everyone spoke in checks and balances, and my voice finally carried to the back row. Thursday was coming with its cinnamon roll and its conference room and its reorganization. I wasn't going to bang on tables or deliver speeches. I was going to do something quieter and longer lasting. I was going to take back my life one signed line at a time by refusing to sign another thing I didn't read. Thursday morning broke clear and cool, the kind of Indiana day that makes you think cornfields might actually whisper. I dressed like any other suburban wife running errands, jeans, flats, a cardigan, then added the navy blazer because armor doesn't have to clang. Elizabeth texted from the Silver Diner at 751 window booth. Coffee's bad, cinnamon rolls worse. I'm here. I thumbed back a heart and drove to Porter and Hale with a box of glazed donuts balanced on the passenger seat like an offering. Women my age know how to walk into male spaces without being noticed you carry food. The parking lot looked like any business morning pickup trucks by the loading bay sedans under the trees, a van with a magnetic sign that read Harlan Fire and Safety crooked on the side. Inside, the receptionist, sweet Caitlin, with the cat eye liner, brightened at the sight of sugar. Rick's in the conference room, she whispered. Big wigs. I shrugged like I was there to drop off napkins at a church picnic. Got it, I said. Where do you want these? She pointed to the break room. I set the box by the coffee pot and took one for myself, a prop more than a snack. When I passed the conference room, the door was half closed. Through the glass, I could see Rick at the head of the table. Shoulders back, sleeves rolled. Just so the man he practiced being. To his right sat a partner from Gaffney and Sloan, the one Elizabeth underlined twice, gray suit watch that knew how much it cost to be admired. Two more men with laptops. A speakerphone glowed in the center like an altar. Rick saw me, smiled the smile he used at Rotary breakfast, and lifted a finger 1 minute. I kept going because wives who hover become scenery. In the break room, Luis, the warehouse manager who'd been with us since we mislabeled 2 pallets and learned the hard way. The difference between Lima, Ohio and Lima, Peru, poured coffee into a mug with a NASCAR number on it. "Morning, Ms. Elaine," he said, then lowered his voice. "You doing okay?" He has the kind of eyes that remind you somebody's watching, even when you think nobody is. I nodded. "We're making it." I said a phrase Indiana uses for grief flood in finance. He glanced toward the conference room. "Lot of suits lately," he murmured. "Funny thing, suits never know how to wrap a pallet." We both smiled. Humor can hold a lot of weight if you stack it right. Rick appeared, paper in hand. "There you are," he said, like I'd hidden under the copier. "Listen, could you do me a favor? Run these down to Civic Bank Just Renewals. They're expecting you. If I tried to get away, they'd hold me hostage." He laughed, which is a kind of lie. He handed me a manila envelope with a yellow sticky on top, a lane sign where "Flagged. Drop at teller." The same handwriting that had labeled the folders in his office now told me where to place my pen. I smiled back like sugar. "Of course, I'm headed that way." I turned the envelope so my phone could see it. The camera made its soft fake click. "Oh, and I brought donuts," I added, because kindness is disarming and I needed him disarmed. "You sweet thing," he said, kissing the air near my cheek. "We'll eat after this call. Might be a while." In the car, I parked 2 blocks over and texted Elizabeth a picture of the envelope, angle and all. Her response was immediate: "Do not sign. Bring to me, if they call stall politely." She added, "Don't go to Civic, go to my bank across town and open a safe deposit box." Then a beat later, "You're doing beautifully." The word steadied me the way a hand at the small of your back does on an icy sidewalk. At the diner, Elizabeth slid into the booth beside me instead of across. "They love to choreograph women," she said, tapping the envelope. "We'll change the steps." She pulled out the documents and laid them flat. The top one was a consent to guarantee assignment, exactly the kind of paper that had been hiding in the trust folder. "If you sign this," she said, "you're the guarantor of the trucking lease through your trust. If the company stumbles, they get to your house by way of your name." The next was a mortgage rider on the HELOC, something about draw extensions and repayment covenants that tasted like tin. The last was branded with Civic Bank's logo, a bland consent to share information for convenience, which is the corporate word for, "We'll tell your husband about your financial life without asking you first." Elizabeth slid a revocation letter across the table. "I drafted this last night. It revokes your limited banking POA. We're overnighting it to the bank's legal department and handing a copy to a branch manager. From this moment, no one should accept your signature on anything. For convenience?" She tucked the envelope back together, added the revocation letter on top, and sealed it with a palm press. "Take this to Civic," she said, "but not until you've opened a safe deposit box at First National and put your flash drive inside. In and out. Smile. Be boring. Boring women are invisible in the best possible way." At First National, the woman at the desk had hair the color of pennies and a sweater vest with tiny embroidered leaves. "Do you prefer a top or bottom box?" she asked, as if I'd requested a booth with a view. I chose top. The attendant led me down a short hall to a room that smelled like old keys and permission. I slid the flash drive into the metal coffin and felt for the first time in days like something might be safe. At Civic, a branch manager with a tie clip met me at a desk with a plant so healthy it looked fake. I handed him the revocation letter. He read it twice and stood up straighter. "We'll update your profile immediately, Mrs. Porter," he said, printing me a receipt like revoking your own vulnerability should be accompanied by paper. "Do you have the renewals?" he asked, glancing at the envelope. I smiled in the way older women learn to smile to get out of tight shoes. "I'm reviewing them," I said, patting the flap. "I'll bring them by this afternoon." He nodded, already moving to a screen that needed scrolling. People who trust systems forget who writes them. By noon, I was back at home scanning what Elizabeth had circled in electric pink, where Rick's plan tucked me into liabilities like lace into a suit. I labeled a folder Civic Renewals Unsigned and printed the date in the corner. The label maker hummed. The dog barked at the mail. Life maintained its disguise. At 2:15, my phone rang. "Rick, everything good?" he asked. "Civic said you dropped something off. He was fishing." "Not yet," I said. I ran into Diane and we sat on the bench outside the bakery. "I'll run by later." I let a laugh hitch in my voice, the kind of laugh men file under women in their talking. He chuckled. "Don't get sucked into a book club." He hung up believing I was where I'd always been, near Pliant available. It takes a long time to teach someone a new word for you. At 4, he came home buoyant. Great day, he said, popping open the fridge, the man in his own commercial. Tomorrow's the big push, and then we coast. He took a fork to the brownie pan like a teenager. Hey, I moved our all hands to Monday morning, he added. Announcements, morale, you know. He waved his fork. Could you make those mini quiches everyone likes? The audacity of men who expect catering at their own ambush would be funny if you weren't the one taking eggs out of the fridge. While he showered for a Rotary dinner, my phone buzzed, an Outlook invite forwarded from Caitlin Emergency Board Meeting, Friday 10:00 a.m., Porter and Hale Conference Room. Attendees Rick, 2 partners, the bank's regional officer Gaffney and Sloan. The memo line, finalize reorg, obtain spousal consents as needed, obtain. As if I were a stapler they needed to retrieve from the supply closet. I forwarded the invite to Elizabeth and added 2 words, I'll be there. She called immediately. You do not have to go, she said. They can't compel a spouse to sign with a calendar link. I know, I said, watching steam fog the bathroom mirror down the hall, but I want a room of ears when I don't sign. She was quiet for a beat. Then, if you go on my terms. I'll be 10 minutes away with 2 motions ready to file, 1 to restrain transfers, 1 to demand the bank require dual signatures on anything touching the house or trust. Understood. And Elaine, do not be baited. No speeches, no scenes. You'll be the calmest person in the room. Put your hands on the table, palms down. Practice breathing slow. When they slide papers across, you say, I'll review with my counsel. If they press, you stand. Thank them for their time and leave. We want them to escalate. Judges dislike men who escalate. After she hung up, I pulled a black dress from the back of my closet, the one with sleeves that made me feel like a grown woman instead of someone's assistant. I ironed it because I wanted the day to crease where I told it to. I laid out a pen that felt like it could write history in a small spiral notebook with a hard cover. I wrote Friday at the top of the first page and left the rest blank, hungry for ink. At dinner, Rick held court about feeder routes and fuel costs while I spooned stew into bowls, nodding at the right beats. He reached for my wrist across the table, his thumb rubbing the spot where my watch had left a pale band. Hey, he said, softening in that way he does when he wants something to seem like romance. Thanks for running those papers today. You always take care of things. I met his eyes and let him see nothing but warm kitchen light. That's what I do, I said. I slept with the notebook on my nightstand and dreamed of a conference room where the air itself held still to hear. Friday would be fluorescent lights, glossy wood, and words like exposure and reorg. I would bring my hands, my breath, my refusal. And I would bring the simplest sentence a woman can say when men have mistaken her for an instrument I will not sign. At 9:52 the next morning, I stood in the lobby of Porter and Hale and smoothed my dress. The receptionist glanced up, startled, like a painting had stepped off a wall. They're waiting, she whispered. I nodded, pressed my palm flat on the cool conference room door, and pushed it open. The room went quiet, the way a basketball gym does after the final buzzer sound still hanging in the rafters, but nowhere to go. Rick looked up from a pile of documents, surprised for only a second before his rotary smile locked into place. The bank's regional officer sat to my left, a woman in a slate suit with a neat bob and a pen that looked expensive enough to write verdicts. Across from her were 2 partners from Gaffney and Sloan. The older one, the underlined name on Elizabeth's pad, swiveled his chair a quarter turn, appraising me like a chess player studies a knight that shouldn't be on that square. Rick gestured toward a chair. Elaine, he said, thanks for coming. This will be quick. I took my seat and placed my small spiral notebook on the glossy table. I wrote the time at the top of the page, 10:01, and underlined it. The older lawyer cleared his throat. Mrs. Porter, we're finalizing a restructuring that will preserve the company and protect all involved. We need a handful of routine consents from you to complete the paperwork. Nothing unusual. In fact, it is designed to minimize your exposure. I glanced at the bank officer. Minimize mine or his. She kept her face, but her left thumb paused on her pen clip for a fraction of a beat. The younger lawyer slid 3 documents toward me with fresh signature tabs like Band-Aids. Consent to guarantee assignment, he said smoothly. Rider to the line of credit. And a standard information sharing agreement with the bank so we can expedite approvals. We understand you've signed similar items in the past. I put my hands flat on the table, palms down like Elizabeth had told me, and looked at the tabs without touching them. My notebook lay open beside the stack, a clean page waiting. I'll review these with my counsel, I said, voice even. Rick laughed too loudly. Honey, we don't need to drag Liz, what was her name, into this. It's housekeeping. We've got a truckload of epoxy resin in Toledo that can't ship until the bank sees this box checked. He tapped the rider with the confidence of a man who believes tapping turns wishes into facts. The older lawyer leaned forward, hands tented tone paternal. Mrs. Porter, there is urgency here. Your cooperation will ensure continuity of operations. Without continuity, jobs are at risk. Vendors get nervous. The press starts to circle. You've been a pillar in this community. This is an opportunity to be that pillar again. I wrote one sentence in my notebook: they want urgency more than consent. Then I looked back up. I don't sign things I haven't read. Of course, the younger one said, smiling, take your time. He slid a fountain pen toward me across the table, the way a magician might slide a deck of cards. His cufflinks winked. I read. Slowly. The guarantee assignment looked almost identical to the draft in the trust folder, except for two details. The date was today, and the reference number matched the trucking lease that had been starving cash the last 6 months. The rider in the HELOC included a covenant I hadn't seen before, language about cross default that would let us stumble at the company, trip our house like a wire. The information sharing agreement would allow the bank to communicate with the company's counsel for convenience, not my convenience. Mrs. Porter, the bank officer, said carefully, breaking her silence, the bank appreciates your cooperation. We view this as a collaborative process. I looked at her pen. It was stopped now. Is the bank comfortable requiring my signature for additional draws on the HELOC? I asked. Given recent activity, her eyes flicked to her briefcase where I imagined a file lived with numbers and arrows she already knew. We can discuss additional controls, she said. Today we're here to finalize. The older lawyer finished, smiling like a man oiling a hinge. I slid the stack back an inch. I'll review these with my counsel. Rick's toe found my shoe under the table, and for the first time in 25 years I moved my foot. The toe hit wood. I turned my notebook so the lawyers could see the blank page. Do you need copies of my revocation of the banking power of attorney? I asked. I filed it yesterday with Civic's legal department. The younger attorney blinked. The older one didn't. That won't be necessary, he said smoothly. Limited POAs are standard, and this paperwork predates any. It doesn't, I said, calm as a calendar. I revoked. I have the receipt. I placed a copy on the table like a place card. The bank officer glanced down at it and then at me, and I watched her write something small in her own notebook. Banking, like teaching, is a profession that respects tidy facts delivered without fireworks. Rick sat back. The smile slipped a notch. Elaine, he said, lowering his voice into the register he uses when a server gets an order wrong, we don't have time for drama. I folded my hands. I agree, which is why I'm not signing anything today. Silence, the heavy kind, took a seat with us. In the hallway, someone laughed by the copier. A truck rattled past outside. The air conditioner kicked on and cooled an already chilly room. The older lawyer clasped his hands and leaned in, careful with his words. Mrs. Porter, he began, if the company fails to reorganize, the consequences could be severe. For you, for your daughter, for employees who have looked to your family for decades. I'm asking you to act in everyone's best interest. Is it in everyone's best interest for my trust to hold guarantees on your client's leases, I asked? Or for our house to cross default on a trucking contract? My voice didn't rise. I didn't move my hands. I have an attorney. She will be in touch with you and with the bank. I will not sign without counsel. He smiled again, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps he said we should take a short break. The bank officer closed her notebook and stood. I could use a coffee, she said, neutral as a newsreader. 5 minutes. In the hallway, Rick caught my elbow. He steered me toward the break room with that careful grip men use when they don't want witnesses to think they're steering. What is this? He hissed, just above a whisper. You're embarrassing me. I'm protecting us, I said. From what? He spread his hands. From help. From my lawyers keeping our company afloat. From me doing what I always do, which is handle it. I thought of the files, the scripts, the photographs of other wives and their brittle smiles. I thought of Plan B, finalize. From being the firewall you designed, I said quietly. Letting the word sit between us like a plate neither of us wanted to hold. His face shuddered. You've been talking to people. I've been reading, I said. And I've been thinking, and I've hired counsel. He took a breath, recalibrating. All right, he said, too smooth. Fine. Bring your lawyer. We'll all talk. If you'd answered your phone earlier, we could have. My counsel answered my phone, I said. She told me to come. For a second, I saw the mask slip the boy who learned early that smiling and pressing would turn adults into yes. Then the mask slid back into place. You're overreacting, he said, and walked back toward the conference room. When we reconvened, the older lawyer tried a different tack. Mrs. Porter, perhaps you'd be more comfortable signing in your own attorney's office. He slid a blank consent form out of a folder. Weekend Courier. I won't be signing today, I said. Or tomorrow. I pushed my chair back slow enough to keep it from squeaking. Thank you for your time. I had my hand on the door when a shadow filled the glass. A man in a blazer and khakis opened it with the careful authority of someone who has practiced serving papers without spilling coffee. Is there a Richard Porter here? He asked, voice pleasant. Rick Porter. Rick stood. You've been served, the man said, handing him a sheaf of documents. He turned to the older lawyer and set another set on the table, and for Gaffney and Sloan. Then he nodded to the bank officer and left as if he'd delivered a casserole. Rick stared at the top page as though language had stopped making sense. The older lawyer flipped through quickly, jaw tightening. The bank officer read the caption, then looked up, expression unreadable. I knew what the first page said. Elizabeth had texted a photo from the diner 10 minutes earlier. Motion for temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. The relief requested enjoin any transfer of liabilities to the spousal trust. Require dual signatures for any draw on the HELOC. Prohibit further guarantee assignments pending hearing. Preserve documents. Cease contact with spouse to obtain consents outside counsel. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply picked up my notebook and the copy of my POA revocation and said, my counsel will coordinate times. Then I left. The receptionist's eyes were wide as plates. In the lobby, Luis tipped his head at me like a person who has watched long enough to know who is stacking pallets in which direction. Outside, the April light felt different, thinner, but more honest. In the parking lot, my phone buzzed. Elizabeth filed. Judge signed the TRO pending hearing. Tuesday, you were perfect. I sat in my car and let the quiet rush over me. No fireworks, no applause. Just the hum of a sedan on an ordinary Friday and the knowledge that I had declined to be the instrument in a song someone else composed. When I pulled out, I didn't go home. I drove to St. Mark's and parked under the maple whose roots buckle the blacktop and sat where I could see the sanctuary lights even in daylight. My hands finally shook, then not from fear but from the adrenaline of saying a simple sentence out loud in a room where men wanted it to be complicated. I will not sign. The all-hands meeting Rick had moved to Monday loomed like a storm edge on the horizon. Employees would want answers. The bank would circle. The lawyers would strategize. The press might sniff. But for the first time since the key glinted in the dish by the phone, I wasn't frozen in a doorway. I had stepped through, and the room on the other side had my name on the doorframe. Monday came like a storm front, gray and restless. By 9 a.m., Porter and Hale's lot was jammed, line workers in Carhartt jackets, dispatchers with clipboards, sales reps tugging at collars they only wore on picture day. People who had carried this company on their backs for decades streamed toward the building, faces wary. Word had leaked, as word always does in small towns. Folks knew something was happening. They just didn't know if the ground would hold under them. Rick strutted through the lobby like a man about to deliver manna. His tie was crimson, his cufflinks little silver trucks. Big day, he said, slapping backs, shaking hands, turning the ship. He loved nautical metaphors, though he couldn't row a canoe straight. I stood near the coffee urns by the break room, blending into the hum. Elizabeth had told me, attend, observe, say little, let the room hear itself. At 10 sharp, Rick banged the conference table like it was a gavel. All right, everybody, let's settle down. He gestured toward a projection screen where the Gaffney and Sloan logo gleamed. The older lawyer stood beside him, wearing the look of a man about to sell snake oil as vitamin tonic. We've brought in some partners to ensure Porter and Hale stays competitive, Rick announced. This is a strategic reorganization, folks. Nothing scary. Just good business sense. Murmurs rustled. Someone from dispatch whispered too loudly. They said that before Midwest Freight folded, the lawyer launched into a slide deck of arrows and pie charts. Debt is leverage, he said smoothly. Leverage drives growth. With your cooperation, the company emerges stronger. Cooperation meant one thing, people working harder for less. Then Rick cleared his throat, the signal that a showpiece was coming. To secure our future, my wife Elaine has graciously agreed to sign key documents. He gestured toward me like a magician revealing an assistant. Head swiveled. Dozens of eyes, many of them eyes that had watched me pour punch at company picnics, waited for me to step up. I didn't. I stayed seated, hands folded on my notebook. A silence fell, broken only by the faint hum of the projector fan. Elaine Rick prompted a tight smile stapled to his face. I stood slowly. I reviewed those documents, I said, voice steady. And I declined. Gas scattered the room. One of the warehouse men muttered, "Lord have mercy." Rick's face flushed a dangerous shade. "Honey, let's not dramatize." I held up the revocation letter. This was filed Friday. Any paperwork that puts our home or trust at risk is void without my consent. And my consent is not given. The lawyer stepped forward, trying to corral the narrative. Mrs. Porter is understandably emotional. That word emotional ignited something in me. No, I said clearly. I'm rational. Rational enough to read fine print. Rational enough to know when a family name is being leveraged into bankruptcy protection while one spouse gets left holding the bag. I looked at the room, not at him. Faces I had known 20 years stared back, truckers with grease still on their knuckles, clerks who balanced ledgers by hand before computers, women who'd shared pews with me at St. Mark's. I won't let my signature be used to take down what we built together. A murmur swelled, the kind that means people recognize a truth they hadn't dared to say. Luis, the warehouse manager, raised his voice. So all them rumors are true. He's sinking us to save himself. Rick spun furious. That's enough out of you. But it wasn't enough. It was only the beginning. Employees started shouting questions about missing overtime, about vendor calls unanswered, about bills bounced. The lawyer clicked frantically, slides forgotten. Rick banged the table again, but the sound was swallowed by voices rising like water breaching a levee. I stepped back, letting the room boil. Elizabeth had been right. The worst thing for men like Rick is to lose control of their own chorus. When he finally shouted, "Everybody quiet," the silence that followed wasn't obedience, it was ice. I spoke into it. I've engaged counsel. A temporary restraining order is in place. Until the court decides no assets can be transferred, no debts reassigned. This isn't rumor. It's fact. I laid a copy of the order on the table. The bank officer, who had slipped in quietly at the back, nodded once. Documentation speaks louder than spin. Rick's jaw clenched. "You've ruined me," he hissed. "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. I just stopped you from taking me with you." The room exhaled, a long collective sound of truth breaking through varnish. Some eyes held pity for him. Most did not. People started filing out, murmuring, shaking their heads. The lawyer packed his laptop, expression sour. The bank officer lingered, catching my eye with a look that said, "You did what we couldn't say out loud." Rick stayed frozen, fists on the table, breathing hard. I gathered my notebook, walked past him, and said the words that had been waiting since the night I opened that door. Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. But today I chose to speak. The hearing was set for Tuesday at 9:00 a.m. Courtroom 4B, the kind with pew-like benches and a flag that made you sit up straighter. Elizabeth met me on the courthouse steps with a travel mug, and that cinnamon roll she kept promising was terrible. "Sugar is sugar," she said, handing it over. Inside, the bank's attorney had a neat folder. Gaffney and Sloan had rolling briefcases and the gait of men who thought the carpet should part for them. Rick sat 2 rows ahead, shoulders pitched forward, the nape of his neck, a color I recognized from nights he'd lost sleep. He didn't turn around. The judge was small, gray-haired, and not impressed by vocabulary. He asked for facts, not adjectives. Elizabeth gave him facts: the trust schedules, the guarantee assignments, the HELOC draws, the consent forms that would have placed me in the blast radius, the temporary order we'd already obtained. The bank's counsel spoke next and surprised me. "We have no objection to dual signature requirements," she said. "We prefer clarity." She did not look at Gaffney and Sloan when she said clarity, but everyone heard where it was aimed. Gaffney and Sloan tried the word business necessity the way a child tries a locked doorknob. The judge didn't budge. "Business necessity," he said, "does not permit you to move liabilities to a spouse's trust without full, informed, and independent consent." He signed the order with a pen that squeaked. Dual signatures required. No further guarantees, no more draws touching the residence. Any restructuring requires notice to this court and council. He peered over his glasses. And if I hear the word convenience used to justify cutting corners, I will start issuing sanctions. A deputy coughed to hide a laugh. Elizabeth smiled with her eyes. Outside, April had turned warm. Elizabeth touched my forearm, the pressure light. Now we negotiate, she said. We aim for clean lines, separate accounts, separate debts, a fair division of assets that still exist, and a plan to unwind the mess tied to your name. She paused. And Elaine, no gloating. Judges smell it on paper. I don't feel like gloating, I said. I feel like sleeping. What followed was not a montage. It was weeks of appointments and phone calls, of scanning and signing, of using a calendar like a second brain. Rick texted, at first blistering, then pleading, then practical. What do you want? I wanted what I had said not to be used as a firewall. We met with a mediator in a room with too many plants, the kind of room that tried to convince you to be the best version of yourself by surrounding you with ficus trees. Elizabeth did most of the talking. I spoke when necessary. Rick watched me like a man who had miscounted and wanted to find the missing digit in my face. The bank cooperated. They preferred to be repaid in a world without drama. Vendors were less kind. Some called me voices sharp with worry because my number had been on cheerful holiday emails for years. I told them the truth: the company would either restructure without using my name as a scapegoat, or it would shrink into something honest enough to pay what it owed. A few hung up angry. Most thanked me for calling back at all. People forgive bad news more easily than lies. Megan came home one weekend, her hair in a messy bun I remembered from track meets and late-night essays. We walked the Monon Trail, and I told her what I could without turning her father into a caricature or myself into a saint. Are you divorcing? She asked, eyes on a cardinal hopping along a fence. The word hung there between us like laundry in a windless yard. I don't know, I said, because I didn't. But we are separating our finances and our integrity. The rest will follow what it needs to. She nodded, and in that nod I saw the woman she was capable of, love that isn't blind and boundaries that aren't brittle. I'm proud of you, she said, not for the fight, for the calm. On a Saturday morning in May, I went to the warehouse with a tray of brownies like I had 100 times. The new COO, a woman Elizabeth had introduced us to with a head for spreadsheets and a spine like rebar, stood beside Luis and passed out schedules. The company, slimmer now, had stopped pretending it could be everything. It was a logistics firm again, not a monument to an ego. Rick was there too, on the periphery. He said hello without reaching for my elbow. It took everything in me not to catalog his face for pity. Pity is a currency in small towns. It spends too fast. At St. Mark's, Pastor Ruth preached on Zacchaeus and restitution. Restitution, she said, holding the word like a piece of bread, is not about humiliation. It is about weight-bearing truth. After the service, she hugged me without asking questions and slipped a note into my hand. Your value does not fluctuate with anyone's ledger. I tucked it into my wallet behind the picture of Megan, with freckles in second grade. The divorce papers, when they came, were folded into a plain envelope. No drama font. Elizabeth and I read them at her bungalow desk, while the peppermints sweated in their bowl. We sent them back with red ink, where red ink was due. The settlement required Rick to refinance whatever he could in his name alone to indemnify me against the trust and the guarantees to transfer back what had been shifted for convenience, that hungry little word. The judge signed. I signed. Rick signed. It was not triumph. It was a passage. On the first Monday of summer, I emptied Rick's office, not with a bonfire, not with revenge songs. I packed the frames and the ribbon and the certificate into boxes and labeled them return. The banker's box with my name stayed with my attorney evidence in a case that would go no further because it didn't need to. I scrubbed the desk with lemon polish because citrus erases fingerprints better than fury. Then I locked the door and gave the key back to the dish by the phone, not as a dare, but as a relic. Diane and I took a road trip to Brown County and split a piece of pie too big for one person. We talked about nothing, recipes, birds, whether she should cut her hair. At a yard sale, I bought a painting from a woman who'd lost her husband and kept his tools. It was of a red barnet. Dusk brush strokes, quick horizon, steady. I hung it over the mantel where our wedding photo had been and didn't feel like I'd erased anything. I felt like I'd placed something honest where a performance had lived. Sometimes I see Rick at the grocery store in the awkward aisle where cereal and laundry soap meet. We say hello. He asks after Megan. I ask after the business. We do not discuss Plan B. We do not discuss keys. In that aisle, I have learned to forgive a little and to forget strategically. On a quiet evening in July, with crickets loud and the porch swing creaking in a rhythm older than my marriage, I wrote a sentence in my notebook and underlined it twice. Respect is the true inheritance. Without it, wealth means nothing. It wasn't a slogan. It was air. It was the difference between a home and a house, a partner, and a plan, a life, and a ledger. If you've listened this far, if you've sat with me through doors and binders and courtrooms and casseroles, I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me. You're not crazy for reading the fine print. You're not disloyal for asking to be treated as a partner. You're not emotional for saying no to a pen slid across a table. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to keep your name from becoming someone else's shield. And if you're standing in front of a door, you've been told never to open. Hear me, sometimes we don't open doors to snoop. We open them to breathe. If this story found you at a kitchen counter with a cup gone cold, or in a parking lot staring at a building that used to feel like safety, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs a steady voice. Tell me what part rang true the key, the folder, the line you finally drew. Subscribe if you want more stories where ordinary people do the bravest thing there is. Refuse, rebuild. No fireworks, just truth patiently applied.